Welcome to episode number 4 of Stories and Sips. I'm Barry Chandler, an Irishman in an American city, helping convert the unsuspecting locals to the joys of Irish whiskey. In this episode, we are focusing on a whiskey that bears the name of the town it was first distilled and the man that made it famous. I'm talking, of course, about Tullamore DEW. As always, I would like to thank the preeminent and indeed only magazine dedicated to Irish whiskey, Irish Whiskey Magazine, with 4 bumper issues a year. It is the voice of the Irish whiskey industry, and I recommend it for those who are interested in our lovely drop of whiskey. Even if you're an amateur, a connoisseur, or indeed a distiller, you will find subscription details for Irish Whiskey Magazine at www.irishwhiskeymagazine.com. Now, this episode would not have contained some of the great nuggets I'm going to share with you if it had not been for Ireland's award-winning Irish whiskey blogger and former Tullamore DEW brand ambassador himself, Mr. Matt Healy from potstill.com. And if you have not checked out his blog and his podcast, you're missing out. And I really recommend you check out his insider interviews and his insights. But I thought it only fitting that Matt be publicly highlighted. And so, Matt, I know you're in Ireland and I'm in America, but I'm going to sit you right here. So you will sit right next to me and the whiskey. I think that's only fitting. So what is the whiskey that we are sipping? Well, if we're talking about Tullamore DEW, we better drink some Tullamore DEW. Complementing this story today will be the lovely sip of Tullamore DEW single malt 14-year-old, and that is aged in oak casks, and then it's finished in 4 different types. That's a nice healthy measure. It's finished in 4 different types of casks. It's finished in bourbon casks, sherry, port, and Madeira. Now, what I love about Irish whiskey is that it is far more than the taste. It's far more than the flavour, the bottle, or the label. See, with so many Irish whiskies, you're sipping the product of hundreds of years of history, hundreds of years of stories. Stories of growth, stories of acquisition, of mergers, of big wins, and even bigger losses. These are stories of characters unique to Ireland. Characters that have shaped not just their businesses, but the industry itself, and certainly even Ireland itself. And one such man is forever immortalized on every bottle of Tullamore DEW. Now, many Americans I speak to about whiskey have assumed that the dew in Tullamore refers to the moisture found on the grass on the hills of Ireland as dawn breaks, but upon closer inspection of the bottle, you'll notice that D.E.W. is revealed to be an acronym, right? An acronym for the man that made Tullamore famous. You might be more familiar with this bottle here, but his name was Daniel E. Williams, and he was one of the characters that changed Irish whiskey industry forever. So in episode number 2, we celebrated Paddy O'Flaherty, who himself was immortalized on bottles of Paddy Irish whiskey for his skill at selling the bottles. But what did Daniel E. Williams do to deserve this accolade? Well, Daniel himself had a longer career in whiskey than most have time on this earth. And his father was an engineer who worked in the distillery, which had opened in Tullamore town in the centre of Ireland in about 1829, a year you'll see stamped on all bottles today, right here. And Daniel started working in the distillery himself as a stable boy, and he started working there when he was just 14. And his family lived a good distance from the distillery. Now, this was before motor cars, and it was too long of a walk to make for a young fella like Daniel each day. So Daniel would sleep in the grain sheds of the distillery. Now, is it just me, or was the work ethic 100 years ago a little stronger than we see today? There's not too many millennials sleeping in grain sheds tonight, I'd say. Now, Daniel's grit and perseverance and work ethic certainly paid off, because by the age of 20, Daniel was a distiller. And by the ripe old age of 25, he was managing the distillery and its entire operations. The distillery was owned at the time by Bernard Daly, who had modernized its operations, and his son, also Bernard Daly. I think they were short on names back then, apparently. But Daniel was the real operator. You see, under his control, he expanded the distillery, he streamlined processes, and he introduced the famous whiskey that bore his initials. And the slogan, indeed, "Give every man his due." Now, Daniel and the distillery were generous benefactors of the town of Tullamore. And thanks to Daniel and thanks to the whiskey industry there, Tullamore saw its first motor car, its first telephone, and even electricity. It's an incredible impact when you think of what one man in the distillery really had in a town and really the generation back then. In the late 1800s, Daniel held the record for the fastest way to get from the Midlands to Dublin. See, back then they used canal barges to send the whiskey all around Ireland. See, draft horses would pull the barge along the river, and Daniel had fresh horses every 15 miles, so the tired horses could be unhitched, and then the fresh horses could take over again. See, that way he wouldn't reduce his speed, and Dublin would get its whiskey grand and fast. Before next day delivery, Daniel was the Amazon of his day. Now, Daniel passed away in 1921, working right up to the day he died, and his grandson Desmond took over the running of the distillery. Not long after he died, in 1925, the distillery actually closed its doors for 13 years to save money. You see, in the 1920s, it was a very difficult time for Ireland and certainly the whiskey industry. You had the effects of prohibition, you had an Anglo-Irish trade war affecting exports, and those are really tough times to survive. The Irish population wasn't enough to sustain a business, certainly of the size of the distillery at the time. And during this time when the distillery was closed, the Daly family sold all of their shares, the remaining shares they had, to the Williams family, who, recognising the challenges themselves of selling Irish whiskies overseas, expanded into other lines of alcohol like heather wine. Like, you might be familiar with the brand Irish Mist that came out of Tullamore, believe it or not. And it came out of their diversification at the time. Daniel's grandson Desmond was as shrewd an operator as his grandfather, and he kept a close eye on trends around the world. Desmond predicted that the evolving palates of his customers around the world demand a different type of whiskey. So he installed a coffee still or a column still in Tullamore in 1948 so that they could make all three types of Irish whiskey. They were making malt, grain, and pot still whiskey, and that allowed them to say that they were the world's first and still the only triple distilled, triple blended, triple cast whiskey. And they made their own unique blend that's a soft, mellow drop of whiskey, very close to the Tullamore blend that we know today. And it allowed them to sell kind of the type of whiskey that best matched the palates of the customers in different parts of the world. And that was way ahead of his time. Fast forward to the post-war 1950s, and that was a time as tough for the whiskey industry as any before it, with the surge in popularity of Scotch whiskies really hitting Ireland hard. So what happened in Tullamore was they decided to focus instead on their Irish Mist brand instead of whiskey. And in 1954 they actually stopped making their whiskey, their blend, completely, and they closed the doors of Tullamore. So what became of the Tullamore distillery and its brand, because it's still around today? Well, they locked their gates in 1954, and in the early 1960s a granddaughter of Daniel Williams married into the famous Powers whiskey family, and over a bit of pillow talk, allegedly, convinced Powers to buy the Tullamore brand. And they did just that, proving that pillow talk is in fact a binding contract. And they started distilling Tullamore whiskey again, this time in Dublin. So now you had a company, Powers Whiskey, that had two Irish whiskies that they didn't want to cannibalize each other. So they focused on selling Tullamore DEW overseas and then Powers in Ireland. See, in Ireland, people are often surprised to hear that Tullamore DEW is the second best-selling Irish whiskey in the world, because for the last 50 years, its growth has taken place outside of Ireland, and it's why most Americans haven't heard of the Powers brand. After Powers was absorbed into Irish distillers, production of Tullamore whiskey and Powers moved from Dublin down to Middleton in County Cork, where they've been distilled pretty much ever since. But the good news for Daniel and Desmond Williams is that production in Tullamore has started again. So William Grant and Sons bought the brand in 2010. They built a new distillery in the town, and in 2014 started to make their first whiskey, 60 years after the last drop was distilled in a town that I think we'd all agree gave the Irish whiskey industry so much over the years. While Daniel E. Williams may have his initials on the bottle, if we are truly to give every man his due, we should recognise the equal, if not superior, contribution of his grandson Desmond in modernising, innovating and sustaining the brand for as long as the economy of the time would allow. So to Daniel and Desmond, to their great story and a great sip, sláinte.